It's a privilege to address you this morning and bring the address this morning. Feels a bit strange. Well, I think it is. I'm not up there. I couldn't face going up there. And as we go on, you might realise why. We're here amid a federal election with a change of premier that no one anticipated. And I'm a Baptist speaking in an Anglican cathedral. And that we're here for the opening of Parliament would be strange to many people in our community, would it not? For many, it's archaic, perhaps even divisive. I think that's understandable given the forces at work in our post-modern world and the confusing state of play between church and state. We're familiar with that term, church and state, or separation of church and state, but I suggest it's not well understood. By state we mean governments of any kind, and by church we mean Christian denominations all putting together into the one pot. I want to explore this a little bit this morning, explaining why I believe it is good that we are here. Many in our community would be surprised to learn that the separation of church and state is not to be found in those wanting to rid the world of religion. It is actually found with those holding deeply religious beliefs, advocating for freedom of religious expression. Baptist roots go back to the first decade of the 1600s, when a group of English separatists stood against the Anglican Church, hence strangeness. At the time, advocating for religious liberty was so dangerous that they lived in exile in Holland. It is here in Holland that the first Baptist church was formed. Not long after, the author to Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan, whose statue adorns the headquarters of Baptists in Great Britain, spent 12 years in prison for preaching without a licence. And Thomas Helwys also found himself in jail for writing a distinctly Baptist treatise on freedom of religion and the lessening of the power of the state church. He died in prison at the age of 41. It was Christians like Bunyan and Helwys who were the forerunners of what we now call the separation of church and state. But the term itself didn't emerge for another 200 years when in 1802, the then President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, penned a letter. The Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut wrote him a letter concerned that the American Constitution did not go far enough in protecting religious minorities from the overreaching work and power of government. In reply, Jefferson asserted that the Constitution was adequate and stated there is a wall of separation between church and state. Hence, it came into our vernacular. A deeply religious man, Jefferson was not speaking of a separation of morality from lawmaking, or that religiously informed opinion should not influence government. Rather, he was insisting that their constitution did ensure freedom of religious expression to all people. The Australian Constitution does the same. It ensures that there will be no state-sponsored religion and no prohibitions put on Australians to stop them from freely practicing their religion. At a state level, it's only the Tasmanian Constitution that mentions religion at all, stating that freedom of conscience and the free profession and practice of religion are, subject to public order and morality, guaranteed to every citizen. Yet despite the similarities with Great Britain or America, the separation of church and state operates differently here in Australia. Halfway around the world, the way the church and the state overlap and interlock in America is somewhat of a mystery to us, don't you think? But equally so, they look at us with wonder, wondering how we can have federally funded chaplaincy programs and funding of private schools and hospitals. That seems just as mysterious to them. These differences, I suggest, find their roots in our histories. For example, you've heard it said that the early founders of the modern America left Europe for their deeply held convictions. Freedom to practice religion from the monarchy, freedom to practice trade from the monarchy. And the first Europeans came to Australia because of their convictions too. But shackled in chains, it had very little to do with freedom. Very different type of conviction. And where was the church in these histories? In America, it was there right at the beginning with the Pilgrim Fathers and remains at the heart of the American narrative of the land of the free. By contrast, the church in modern Australia began with a chaplain who was a little more than an afterthought. Arriving in Sydney Cove to establish a penal colony, the chaplain was under orders. He was not only to guide the spiritual life of the colony, but provide education and be a moralising force for the convicts. The early chaplains were also appointed magistrates. This ensured that the church was far removed from any freedom narrative and put it in league with the governing authorities ruling it over the people. No wonder church and state is a little bit confusing and different in Australia. One of this morning's readings from the Gospel of Matthew relays an incident between Jesus and some of his protagonists. Israel was ruled by Rome at the time and occupied by their military. The Jews hated it. That's true, isn't it? Some hoped Jesus would lead a rebellion against the Romans, but he proved a big disappointment. And his critique of the Jewish religious leaders offended them so much they just wanted to get rid of him. Normally enemies, the devoutly religious Pharisees and the worldly Herodians joined together to try and trap Jesus. To appreciate the irony, just think of right-wing liberals and Greens working together. You'll get the idea. They aimed to catch Jesus in a gotcha question. None of you know what gotcha questions are, I'm sure. You know what it means. You try to get someone to say something that gives good reason to trip them up. In this case, to arrest Jesus, or at least cause him deep problems. And they thought they had the perfect question. And guess what it was about? Taxes. Always about taxes. No one likes paying taxes. For a pious Jew, paying taxes to Rome was the worst. So they came to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the ways of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances." Talk about buttering him up, trying to gently lead him into the gotcha question. "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Here's the snare. If Jesus were to answer yes, thousands of people would see him as a weak-spined sympathiser of Rome, afraid to speak up for injustice. If he were to answer no, he would immediately find himself charged with a capital crime of sedition by the Romans. And if he simply refused to answer, he would be embarrassed and hopefully silenced. But with a coin in hand, Jesus asks, whose image is on it? Everyone knew it was Caesar's. So Jesus simply states, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's." Simply brilliant. Politically and legally, it wasn't damning. And to patriotic Jews, not one of them would see it as a sellout. Everyone was amazed. It's profound too, right up to this day. By advocating the Jews give back to Caesar what is Caesar, Jesus gave the governing authorities, in this case the Romans, a legitimacy they'd never known before. But at the same time, he set boundaries that Rome was yet even to begin to acknowledge. Two authorities, God and Caesar, roughly translating to church and state, each with their own jurisdictions, each with their own responsibilities, held in tension side by side. Took the early church a little while to work out the implications of this. They rode the tension. On the one hand, they understood there is no authority except that which God has established, yet God has delegated authority to human governments. Their conclusion? Church people should obey the state, and they should also pray that the state does not go beyond its delegated authority. Hence our prayers this morning. For the next 300 years, the church faced stiff opposition and at times persecution from the Roman authorities, even to death. But by 313, the church had grown in such numbers and such strength that the Emperor Constantine decriminalised Christian worship. This began a process of the amalgamation of the state with the church and the church with the state, and it became a pattern across Europe for the next more than 1,000 years. There were still protests by various Christian groups, of course, but they were silenced. The outcome of this union between church and state was mixed. I don't believe it's difficult to prove from history that the church is easily seduced by power. A cosy relationship with the church and with the state by the church ends up with it sanctioning corruption, totalitarianism and oppression, and even murder. The exact opposite of what Jesus was teaching. But the state isn't exempt either. It too is seduced by power. You see it when the state begins to suppress the voice of the church or religions. I'm sure I don't need to remind you how the state gone rogue has resulted in so many millions of deaths, so much more than ever the church seduced has produced. That's why render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's is so helpful for us even today. It suggests two jurisdictions of authority, distinct and separate, yet working alongside each other, side by side. It's somewhat idealised, maybe, and certainly full of a lot of tension, but a tension I believe that's worth wrestling for the good of the people and the future. In the middle of last year, Hobart Baptist Church hosted a public panel discussion. On the panel was Paul Dare, an Indigenous man, two parliamentarians, Jackie Petrusma and Cassie O'Connor, and myself. Our topic was the place of spirituality and religion in the future of Tasmania. It's an important and critical discussion to have, for despite what many in our community assume and many hope for, religion is not going away. Pew Research in the US shows how across the world the percentage of people who say they are religious is increasing, not decreasing. And there are no signs that it is about to change. I suggest that's a trend we can't ignore, so we need to have the conversations. But it's not a conversation of whether religion should stay or go, because religion isn't going away. It's a discussion about what is good religion and what is bad religion. There are forces at work in our community clearly intent on wreaking havoc on everything good our Western tradition has produced. It's an ideological set of beliefs to rival any religious system. It needs to be rigorously scrutinised along with all sets of beliefs, including Christian. I'm thankful to the Premier for his request to include the reading from Romans. After a lengthy discussion about Jesus Christ and all he accomplished, the Apostle Paul gets down to the practical outworking of it. And here's my quick précis. Don't think too highly of yourself. Recognise we're all part of each other and we need each other. We all have a job to do, but we're gifted differently. So let's get on and use our gifts for the common good. It's about serving and using what we have for each other. Nothing to do with self-promotion. I'm a minister of religion. There are many here, members of Parliament, who are ministers of the Crown with a portfolio. We're all tarred with the same brush. We're set aside by the community to serve. I'm not suggesting that's an easy gig. We're here today because our previous Premier felt he had no more to give. While we may not agree with all that he said and did, we nevertheless thank him for his service and the load he carried through 2 years, difficult years. But there's still work to be done. You're still here. And we are here to give our best for the good of this beautiful island. It's a wonderful part of the world to live, is it not? Our concerns may seem trivial in the context of the conflicts around the world. Think of Myanmar, Afghanistan, Yemen, Tigray. And how can we not feel shocked and enraged at what's happening to the people in Ukraine? As we watch their suffering unfold in real time, who of us does not feel inept, powerless before such manifest evil? In the light of all our partisan divisions, don't they appear small and trivial in the light of that? But if nothing else, these conflicts remind us that what we do enjoy here in Tasmania is fragile, and we are fragile. And we need vigilance, and we need each other to sustain it. To do that, as strange as it may seem, I believe a critical step for us is to find a way for church and state, church and religion, whatever you want to call it, to forge a uniquely Aussie way of working together. Yes, there are tensions in that. There always have been and always will be. But if we respect our different authorities, acknowledge each other's gifts, choose not to think too highly of each other and ourselves, and call out the best in each other, then I believe we have a much better chance of securing a good future for future generations of Tasmania. That is why I sense it's good that we're here today, because we're trying to forge something new and fresh, even if it appears strange to many in our community. So as we begin this new Parliament and pray for it, we pray for you. We pray for you, Premier. Thank you for stepping up into the job. And we pray for all our elected representatives. And our prayer is that God may sustain you as you serve our community. And we pray for all Tasmanians that we might respect and obey, but that we would use our gifts and talents, our resources and our experience to keep you honest, but also do it for the betterment and the future of the people of Tasmania. So help us God.